Hi everyone, my name is Andrew J. Clark. I'm a commercial and landscape photographer based in Perth, Western Australia, and welcome to my YouTube channel. This is my first real YouTube video, and I've got something pretty special for you. This is the Sony A7C, the first camera in a brand new lineup of full-frame compact cameras from Sony. What might be pretty obvious to anyone familiar with full-frame cameras is this thing is really small, like really small and really light. Sony says this is the smallest and lightest full-frame camera ever. Technically, the Sigma FP is smaller, but that doesn't have in-body image stabilization, and it really does sit in a different segment from this one. This is designed to be a hybrid stills and video camera, much like the A7 III. Speaking of the A7 III, the internals of this camera are very similar. It's got that full frame 24 megapixel sensor, and it has very similar stills and video features. The standout differences between the A7 III and the A7C, number one, the fully articulating reversible flip out screen. Number two, updated autofocus with real-time tracking, animal IAF, eye autofocus in video mode, and a few other autofocus quality of life improvements. Number three, only one card slot in this camera. Now, before we jump into my full thoughts and review of the A7C, having used it for about the past 10 days in a variety of different circumstances, I do have to say that I am a sponsored Sony photographer. I'm sponsored by Sony Australia, and I run events and workshops and presentations in collaboration with Sony throughout the year here in Perth and around Australia. Sony did also lend me a copy of the A7C for the purpose of an upcoming workshop series. More on that workshop series in a future video. But I'm not getting paid for this video in any way from Sony or from anyone else. And in fact, because I'm so new to YouTube, I'm not going to be able to monetize this video in any way. So I'm doing this review completely independently, and there's going to be no oversight from Sony on this video whatsoever. Okay, with that said, I'm going to jump into my overall thoughts for the camera at the very top. This is a very capable stills camera and a very capable video camera. Sony has not needed to make that many sacrifices to get the full frame sensor into the smaller and lighter camera body, even while adding things like the fully articulating screen. Is this the perfect camera? No, definitely not. There's a few quirks about the design and a few quirks in the functionality that I'm not a particularly big fan of. That being said, I understand that this camera is going to be positioned in the market beneath the A7 III, and if pricing reflects that, I think it's going to be quite a good value camera. In particular, I think this is going to be great for enthusiasts and hybrid shooters. It could even work as a professional second camera, and I think it's going to be excellent for new vloggers and video makers who want something really small, light, practical, but don't want to give up incredible image quality and amazing autofocus. In my experience with the camera so far, there's been three things that have stood out to me as being less than ideal. Number one, there's been no dramatic improvement to the in-body image stabilization. Sony's said that there is a slight improvement, but my experience trying to vlog with this camera was that the stabilization still doesn't quite stack up to some of the competition. Sony also haven't added in any sort of active stabilization that we've seen on the ZV-1 and on the A7S III. Number two, video modes, as far as I can tell, are identical to the A7 III. That means there's no 4K 60 and there's no 10-bit 422. Would you expect those in an entry-level full-frame camera positioned below the A7 III? I think in 2020 you probably do. So I think Sony have missed an opportunity here to really make an absolute slam dunk must-buy camera if they'd been able to pack in those 2020 video features. Number three, single card slot. It's one of those things you either need it or you don't. For a lot of my work, I do need it. When you're working with paid commercial clients, you need to be able to shoot redundantly to two cards just in case something fails. If you're a wedding shooter, same thing. But I also understand that a large section of the target market for this camera is not going to be fussed by that. I haven't had a card failure in years, but that's just a question you're going to have to ask for yourself. Okay, enough with the high level stuff. Let's jump into talking about the body specifically, because that is really the big change with this new lineup with the A7C. Now I've got in front of me the original A6000 and the A7 III over here, and you can see that the A7C sits pretty comfortably in between the two. The body is most reminiscent of the A6600. Sadly, I don't have one that you can look at, but it wouldn't be much of a comparison because they are incredibly similar in dimensions. The big standout differences, yes, this is larger than the A6000, but the improvements here have been to incorporate the Z series battery, like on the A7 III, and the grip size is much closer to the A7 III than the 6000, which I think is a welcome change for most people. In terms of ergonomics and things like button placements, it's a bit of a mixed bag. A few of the buttons have been moved around and put into better positions, such as the record button on this top plate here and the AF on button on the back here. But what is really striking for me is the almost complete absence of custom buttons. As someone who's been shooting on Sony cameras for several generations now, I've become really accustomed to having one or two, usually two, custom buttons on the top of the plate, one custom button at the top on the back, and one custom button in the bottom right-hand corner. That's the general layout for most of the full-frame cameras. We can see on the A7 III, two custom buttons on the top, a third custom button top left on the back of the camera, and one custom button on the bottom right of the camera as well. In addition, all of the other buttons are reprogrammable. Even on the A6000, we had one custom button on the top and a second custom button in the bottom right. So the A7C only having the one custom button, just marked C in the bottom right-hand corner on the trash icon, is definitely not ideal from my perspective. I'm very much used to customizing those buttons, even shoot by shoot, depending on whether I'm shooting landscape, sports, or video modes, to have the most convenient thing on the most convenient button at any time. I will say that Sony have given us separate function menus for both stills and video, so that goes some way into making up for this. If you are heavily into customizing your camera, just like I am, keep in mind that you can customize or remap the AF on button, any of the scroll wheel buttons, the center button, and of course the C button in the bottom right. On top of that, we now have 3 memory recall shoot modes on this top dial here, and that is a welcome change and a welcome upgrade over the 2 on the A7 III. I make frequent use of these memory recall shoot modes when I'm shooting in hybrid situations, going back and forth between stills and video, where I often have a completely different camera setup. Before I move on from the body, a quick thing about the I/O ports on the side here. Because we've now got that fully articulating screen, it is important that these I/O ports are done well, and I think Sony have made some really good decisions here. The only one of these ports that meaningfully impacts the screen is this center door here, but all that has behind it is the memory card slot. And so you're never going to be shooting with that door open. Up the top, we have the microphone door. I found in my use so far that this door is a little bit hard to get open if you don't have long fingernails. But the upside is, as you can see, it doesn't really impact the top of the screen, even when you have a mic coming out. This bottom I/O door flips down, which I think is a really good design decision. And even when you've got cables plugged into the USB-C port, which by the way is a USB 3.2 port, or the micro HDMI up the top here, it doesn't really impact the screen. At worst, it'll cover up your shutter speed setting, which is often something that's locked off when you're shooting video anyway. So all in all, I think the I/O ports have been designed pretty well. Next, let's have a brief chat about image quality and the sensor in this camera. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because it is, for almost all intents and purposes, the same camera internally as the A7 III from an image quality standpoint. And that was certainly my experience shooting for the last 10 days or so. I've been shooting on the A7 III for a couple of years, so I'm very familiar and very comfortable with what that camera can do. I can say that I was getting very, very similar results, both in stills and in video with the A7C. As of recording this video, I haven't been able to access any of the raw files, but I'll put up a couple of processed JPEGs so you can get a general idea and zoom in so you can see the resolution. And I found, even though I'm used to shooting with the A7R Mark IV, a 61 megapixel camera, I found the 24 megapixels on the A7C to be enough for basically all of my still shooting needs. Now, I mentioned before that the recording modes on this camera in terms of video are basically the same as the A7 III. So again, I'm not going to spend too much time delving into those because if you're interested in that, there's a wealth of knowledge online already discussing the capabilities of the A7 III as a video camera. In short, it's a very, very capable video camera and you get excellent image quality shooting at 4K 24, at 4K 25 or 30, depending on what region you're in. And you do get access to high frame rates, 60 frames a second, 120 frames per second at your HD resolution, but sadly no 4K 60 in this camera. One more big change before I start reeling off the little quality of life improvements in this camera. It uses the same multi-interface hot shoe as is in the A9 Mark II and the A7R Mark IV, and this allows you to use Sony's digital shotgun microphone, the ECM B1M. I think I've got that right. If I've got that wrong, I'll put the product number down the bottom here. And what's really cool about that capability is that it'll send the audio signal digitally through the hot shoe. So you don't need to run any sort of wire out from the microphone into the camera. And it's also powered through the hot shoe as well. So I thought getting my hands on this camera and having the fully articulating screen, I'd try my hand at a bit of vlogging. So I went out on a couple of shoots. I'll chuck in a little bit of footage from those two shoots at the end of this video, but one thing I'll show you now is just how small, light, compact my vlogging setup was. I was using the A7C combined with Sony's newish 20mm f1.8 G lens. Again, another very small and light piece of kit. And for audio, that digital microphone I was talking about earlier. That combination of gear I found to be incredibly easy to use and so lightweight that I could just hold the camera out with the lens, with the microphone at arm's length in a vlogging orientation, and my arm just really wasn't getting tired. All right, so those are the highlights. I think we've covered off the main stuff which separates this camera from the A7 III and the other cameras in Sony's lineup. But there are a good number of other little changes, some small quality of life improvements that all together show just how much Sony's been iterating in the last few generations of cameras. So if you're still with me at this point, we're just going to power through these changes. All right, number one, there's a new shutter system. Apparently it's made out of carbon fiber and there's less vibration. There is an updated stabilization kit inside the camera. I mentioned this earlier. Overall, I didn't find that the stabilization was greatly improved, but perhaps there is a little bit of an improvement there. Color science in this camera has been updated. It's apparently not as good as the A7S III, which had a complete rework, but it's on par with the A7R IV. I did notice in my shooting that the color science did look quite good. Skin tones looked natural, improved over the A7 III, but you can sort of judge it for yourself because I'm shooting currently on the A7R IV. So if you like the skin tones in this video, it's going to be basically the same in the A7C. One thing I didn't mention when talking about the autofocus update is that there's now touch to track using the touchscreen. Okay, another thing brought across from the A7R IV, the ability to change your focus point indicator away from a gray to either white or to red. That's a welcome quality of life improvement. You can now record video in both NTSC or PAL format onto the same card without having to reformat first, so that's nice. The camera will also recognize vertical video formats and save it into that orientation. Battery life, as I mentioned earlier, is slightly improved over the A7 III, and that was certainly my experience. And lastly, the body incorporates a new magnesium alloy. I'm sure that's been done again to reduce weight. So the last big unknown is really the price. Whether or not this turns into a camera that I recommend to lots of people or only to a select few is really going to turn on where Sony can position it in the market. My understanding is that it's supposedly positioned beneath the A7 III. So if they can make it a few $100s cheaper than the A7 III, that strikes me as pretty good value. The A7 III, when it came out, turned into perhaps the most popular full-frame camera of the last few years because of how versatile it is as a stills and video camera. My experience with the A7 III is it's basically improved in little ways across the board. So yeah, that's it. That's all I've got to say about the A7C at this point. I'm sure there's something that I've left out of my review, so if you've got any questions, feel free to chuck them in the comments below. I'll definitely be answering those. Honestly, if it wasn't for the A7S III coming out, I'd probably replace my A7 III with this camera for the improved video features. The fully articulating screen, the real-time tracking is going to make a big difference over the A7 III. And it's probably going to be a camera that I recommend depending on price to a lot of photographers. If you'd like to see some actual footage captured on the A7C, hang around for some vlog style clips which I took recently on a couple of landscape trips around Perth. And thanks so much for watching. Alright, so I've made it out to John Forrest National Park. It's pretty surprising that it's taken me so many years to get out here. It's a pretty classic landscape photography spot, only about half an hour's drive east of Perth. There's a few different waterfalls around. I think the paths are pretty clear. Sort of got a dual purpose for today's shoot. It's going to be my first landscape photography vlog, but I'm also testing out a new Sony camera, full frame camera, the A7C. So it's about a 2K hike to the National Falls. Left it a little bit late in the day to make it there, but this is the classic life of a landscape photographer, so let's get a move on. So I've got a fair amount of experience shooting landscapes on Sony cameras. I started off with the A7, the A7S, I've had the A7R2, I've used the R3, I now own the R4. But this is my first attempt at vlogging, so I'm sort of approaching this camera in a similar way to what the target demographic will be. I'm an absolute beginner when it comes to recording vlogs. So the forecast for today was showing clouds clearing right around sunset, so by heading east, I'm maximizing the chance that there might still be some of these clouds in my shot right around sunset. But looking at the rest of the sky, I'm not as optimistic as I was earlier. Felt like I was walking aimlessly for 10 minutes there, but thankfully the path was super straight and I've made it to the falls. So I'm going to scout around now and see if I can find a perspective for sunset, but I've noticed that the western direction is down the falls, which I'm not sure if that's going to work. I'm going to be shooting directly into the sun. Hopefully some of the very few remaining clouds are going to linger around to soften the light a little bit. This is why it's really important to get to your landscape shoots early. I didn't know from looking at the map whether the main path was going to take me to the top of the falls or to the base of the falls. Generally speaking, being at the base of the falls is going to be better for landscape photography. So as I was scouting around up the top, I spotted this path off in the distance, which while looking a tiny bit precarious, should take me pretty quickly down to the base of the falls. Notice that on this side of the river, you're having to contend with this pretty annoying lookout right there. I'm gonna have to find a way to the other side of the river. Looks like the river's just thin enough here for me to jump across a couple of rocks. Well, it's taken me a minute to find a decent perspective, but I like the look of this right here. And it's looking strangely reminiscent of a photo I saw recently from a good friend of mine, Riley, on his show King of the Still. A little bit of plagiarism is okay, right? One of the things I'm loving about this camera is the fully articulating screen. Means that I can just sort of pop it down anywhere on the ground, tilt the display upwards so I can see it, plonk it down, and get on with the rest of my shoot. Shooting on the A7R Mark IV today, the GM 24-70. Need a little bit of extra reach to get to the waterfall in the background, and probably going to go with a vertical composition.
So I've just packed up my tripod and I'm making my way back up the little valley here. Sadly, all the color sort of died out and the clouds faded away off into the east. So not really a great afternoon for landscape photography. I did take a couple of snaps of the waterfall and I think, you know, the composition might have some merit, but I'm definitely going to be coming back with some stronger conditions to take the shot again. But I must say, it was a really great day to try out vlogging for the first time. My first impressions of the A7C are definitely that it's a well thought out camera from a vlogging and videography perspective. The big standout is obviously that fully articulating screen. Coming from someone who shot on Sony for a few generations and not had the benefit of that, it really does make composing your B-roll and establishing shots much, much easier. And also to make sure that your talking headshots, just like this one, are at least moderately well composed and in focus and whatnot.
Oh, hey. Thanks so much for watching the whole video. If you're thinking maybe you'd like to see some other content from me on this platform, you can hit subscribe. I'm going to be coming out with the first video in a new landscape series talking about shooting landscapes specifically on Sony for Sony photographers. So yeah, hit subscribe if you'd like to see that, and thanks so much for watching.